What I want to do for this morning is to focus on the first half of that lesson, the first piece of it, where the man comes and asks about Jesus, what is the greatest command? But we're doing it in the midst of, we have a series of that we're going through right now that has to do with your piece of the puzzle, right? So if you look at your leaflet at the beginning of it, right on the front cover, it says your piece of the puzzle, right? And so we're talking about, during this season of the year, about the fact that each one of us has a piece of the puzzle. And if everybody brings their piece of the puzzle, then we'll be able to see something that's really brilliant and glorious because it's God. It's the work that God is doing here and through us. And so, but each person has a piece. No matter how little or how big, no matter how young or how old, every person has a piece to be able to bring to this puzzle. And we can see that in the past, the way that God has used all different kinds of people to be able to bring us to this particular point. So there were people who worked really hard over the last 80 years to bring St. Mary's to this point. And then there are people in the present who are doing things. And then next week, Father Kaz will be with you, and he's going to look at what's going to happen into the future. So for today, we're looking at the present, and we want to look at the lesson that Jesus was talking about when this man comes to Jesus. Right then, he calls him, kind of out in front of everybody else, and he says, "So tell me, Jesus, you're supposed to be so great and so wonderful, so tell me, what is the greatest commandment of all?" And he was hoping to trip him up because that's, it's people oftentimes wanted to pick fights with Jesus. And Jesus said, he said, the most important thing is to, and he quoted this. He said, this is from the Old Testament. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it's called what the Jews call the Shema. That's the word for hear. So hear, O Israel. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And so that was the big deal. So what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And they got it. They understood that was the greatest commandment. And in fact, so much did they understand that was the greatest commandment that they wrote it on little pieces of paper, and they put it in a box that was called a phylactery. Can you say that with me? Phylactery. It's a tough word. And they actually tied it on their forehead when they went to pray. Men who were Jewish actually tied it on their forehead, put it in a box, and that was to remind them what was the most important commandment, what was the most important thing that they were supposed to do, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's what they did. They knew that was important. Not only did they put it on their head when they went to prayer, but they also, can you see over on this boy, this is a boy at his bar mitzvah, when young boys become men, it's the celebration of their manhood. And so you can't really see it, but this older gentleman here has a phylactery on his forehead. The young boy has one on his forehead, and he also has one on his left arm. And the reason that he has one on his left arm is because it's close to your heart. And so, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And so, they understood that you're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, so much so that when they went to prayer, men put it on their forehead, put it on their arm. Not only that, but there was a little box that they put on the side of their door. And in that box is a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper is the same thing. So they got the idea that you were supposed to do that. And so wherever they went in prayer, here, and on the doorpost of their house, they knew that's what they were supposed to do. But Jesus did something that nobody else up until that point did. He said, not only is it love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but he said there's another one. And he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, in the gospel lesson for today, it says, alongside the first one is the second one. And so here's this guy who is standing in front of Jesus trying to trip him up, trying to give him a hard time. And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's just like the first commandment. So it's not a wonder that this guy might have thought, oh, what am I trying to do to Jesus? What am I trying to do to him? And then this whole thing, it's easy, I suppose, for us to be in our bedroom or to be in church and to say, God, I love you. That's a really good thing to do. God, I love you. I love you, God. So we say it in worship. We say it in our hearts. We say, God, I love you. But then Jesus asks us the question, yeah, but how do you take that love that God has for you, that love that you have for God, and how do you turn it into love for the people who are around us? Because all of a sudden things get really messy, don't they? When we open our eyes from having loved God and we look around, all of a sudden there are people that sometimes are not so easy to love, like brothers and sisters, like moms and dads, like husbands and wives. All of a sudden, love becomes costly, doesn't it? Love always costs. Love always has a price. You always got to pay some kind of a price. And what we love the most costs the most. But it's worth it. I remember when I was just graduating from college, and this woman, Darla, was in my life. And, I wanted her to marry me. And yet we have this custom that you're supposed to give a ring, to the girl when you ask her to marry you. And so I said, oh, gosh, I didn't have any money. I had no money. And yet, I needed this ring. And so, because I loved her, I worked, and I saved, and I worked, and I saved, and I worked, and I saved, and then I spent some, and I splurged some, and then I felt guilty because I did that. And so then I worked, and I saved, and still, I didn't have enough money to be able to buy this ring, and I'm pouring my soul into this ring. And so I said to God, so God, where am I going to get enough money to be able to buy this ring? And so it's like, I just don't know. It was my senior year in college. I went out to get into my car on one particular morning, and I went out, and my car had a scrape all along the side of it. Kind of like somebody had parked along it and then backed out and raked across the side of my car. And I looked at that scrape, and I did a little dance. Woo! Why do you think I did a little dance? Because my car was insured. And so I ran into my dorm, and I ran to the phone, and I called the insurance company, and they sent me a check, and finally I had enough money to be able to buy a ring for my wife to be. And so then every time I went out to my car after that, after having bought that ring, every time I went out to the car, I went out and I looked at the scrape in the side of my car, and it was like, I love her. It was worth it. It was worth driving around with a scrape in the side of my car. And in fact, every time I looked at it, it was a reminder of how much I loved her and the sacrifice that was there. Jesus says that it is as we show love to the people who are around us, and that love is the love that God works in our hearts, then all of a sudden he begins to change us, and we look to the people who are around us trying to find ways of loving. Now, that's great when you're in love, but what about when you're not just simply in love? When all of a sudden the people who are around you are kind of sometimes tough to love, harder to love, but yet this love that God has for us and we have for him changes our hearts, but it still costs us. Jesus, when in this exact same story in the Gospel of Luke, he goes on to finish the story with the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember that story? Does anybody know that story? Does anybody know that story? If you know that story, raise your hand. Do you know the story of the Good Samaritan? All right. Now, I'm not going to read that story. I'm wondering if we can tell that story together. Can we tell it?